Welcome to the Real Money Pathway, where I share my journey from financial collapse to lasting wealth. I'm David Kim, and I'll guide you through practical strategies that transform my finances and can transform yours too. Let's build your pathway to financial freedom.
The content of this podcast is provided for general information purposes only and do not constitute financial advice. Listeners should not act upon the content or information here without first seeking appropriate advice from a financial professional.
Welcome back to the Real Money Pathway. I'm David Kim, author of The Real Money Guide, the missing manual for financial recovery. Through our first 8 episodes, we've explored my journey from financial collapse to rebuilding, covering everything from the psychological aspects of money to creating systematic approaches for emergency fund, cash flow management, debt handling, and credit rebuilding. Today, we're focusing on what might seem like the smallest, most insignificant part of financial recovery, but one that ultimately proved transformative in my journey. We're talking about the power of starting small, specifically with just $25 at a time. I still remember sitting at Casey's kitchen table about 3 months after my bankruptcy, feeling completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of financial rebuilding ahead. Just beginning to stabilize my consulting income, the journey back to even zero net worth seemed impossibly distant, let alone building genuine financial security. As I expressed this overwhelming feeling, Casey asked me a question that changed everything. Can you save $25 this week? Even in my financial distress, I could honestly answer yes. That number was small enough to be achievable despite my circumstances, but significant enough to represent real action rather than just symbolic effort. That first $25 transfer to a dedicated savings account felt almost meaningless against the backdrop of my financial collapse, but it represented something more important than the amount itself, a commitment to consistent, positive action regardless of circumstances. The next week, I transferred another $25, then another, building what would eventually become the foundation of my financial recovery. Today, I want to share how this seemingly insignificant starting point eventually created transformative financial change, and how similar small beginnings can drive your own financial journey, regardless of your own current situation. Because the truth is, financial transformation rarely happens through dramatic single actions. It emerges through consistent, small behaviors compounded over time. The power of small financial actions extends far beyond their mathematical impact. While $25 weekly contributions eventually create meaningful accumulated amounts, their psychological benefits often prove even more valuable during financial recovery. My first small savings transfer created what psychologists call a success experiment, a concrete action that demonstrates capability rather than just theoretical potential. This tangible evidence of financial progress, however modest, established proof that improvement was possible despite challenging circumstances. This reality directly contradicted the pervasive sense of helplessness that financial trauma often creates. After bankruptcy, I frequently felt completely powerless over my financial situation, as if larger forces beyond my control determined my circumstances. That simple $25 transfer established tangible evidence that I retained at least some financial agency despite significant limitations. The modest nature of these small actions also bypass the psychological resistance that often prevents larger financial changes. When Casey suggested saving $25, the amount really seemed too small to trigger that internal objection, justifications, and fears that might have emerged with more ambitious targets. This psychological pathway around resistance created momentum that larger goals might have prevented. Perhaps most importantly, these small successes establish what psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief in our ability to accomplish specific types of tasks successfully. Financial trauma significantly damages this self-efficacy, creating deep doubt about our own capability to manage money effectively. Each successful small action rebuilds this essential confidence gradually but consistently. My own confidence progression followed a pattern common to many financial recovery journeys. The first several $25 transfers felt like isolated actions without larger significance. It created minimal confidence beyond the specific task itself. After about 2 months of consistent weekly transfers, totaling around $200 in savings, I began developing After about 2 months of consistent weekly transfers, totaling about $200 in savings, I began developing a domain specific confidence. It's the belief in my ability to maintain consistent savings behavior specifically. Then, by 6 months into this practice, which accumulated savings around $600, this domain specific confidence began expanding to broader financial management areas. The evidence of consistent, successful action in one financial dimension created my own confidence that gradually transferred to other money management aspects. After a full year of weekly contributions, resulting in approximately $1,300 in savings, I experienced meaningful restoration of general financial confidence that supported increasingly ambitious money management actions beyond just consistent saving. This progression revealed an important principle. Financial confidence returns through tangible evidence accumulated consistently rather than through positive thinking alone. No amount of affirmation or encouragement created the confidence that emerged through witnessing my own demonstrated capability through regular successful actions. For those beginning similar small action approaches, several psychological principles from my experience proved particularly valuable. First, focus on consistency rather than amount, particularly during that early recovery phase. The unbroken chain of weekly actions, never missing a single transfer regardless of circumstances, created more psychological benefit than larger but irregular contributions would have provided. Second, celebrate process over outcomes initially. Recognizing that behavior establishment matters much more than accumulated amounts during this foundation building. My weekly transfers received acknowledgement regardless of the growing balance, reinforcing the action pattern rather than just resulting savings. Next, maintain physical evidence of progress through visual tracking systems. My simple wall chart showing each weekly contribution created tangible reminder of consistent positive action that digital tracking alone might have made less psychologically impactful. Then recognize small actions as evidence of character development rather than just financial improvement. Each modest contribution demonstrates growing self discipline, commitment capability, and follow through capacity beyond that specific financial impact. And finally, share progress appropriately with supportive individuals and mentors who recognize the significance of these small and consistent actions. Casey's acknowledgement of my weekly transfer streak validated the psychological importance of this consistency beyond the modest amounts involved. The cumulative psychological impact of these small wins extended far beyond savings accumulation. The demonstrated ability to commit to and maintain consistent positive financial actions gradually rebuilt general self trust that financial collapse had severely damaged. This restored belief in my own financial capability eventually supported much more significant money management actions that substantial recovery required. For those currently experiencing financial challenges similar to my post bankruptcy situation, recognizing the psychological significance of small actions creates important perspective beyond their mathematical impact. The $25 weekly transfers mattered less for the dollars accumulated than for the self perception transformation they gradually created from what I saw as a financial victim and failure to now a capable money manager making intentional progress despite circumstantial limitations. This psychological transformation represents the foundation for sustainable financial recovery beyond temporary behavior changes or brief motivation periods. By establishing evidence based confidence through consistent small actions, we create the essential belief system that supports long term financial behavior and the transformation well beyond it that willpower alone might be able to sustain. Beyond their psychological benefits, small, consistent actions provide the perfect foundation for building sustainable financial systems that eventually create significant growth. These initial systems establish both infrastructure and habits that support increasingly substantial financial progress as circumstances improve. My $25 weekly transfers quickly evolved from isolated manual actions to a systematic approach that eventually supported much larger financial development. This progression from individual behaviors to structured systems creates efficiency, consistency, and scalability that accelerated recovery as resources expanded. The systematic evolution began with establishing an MVP of sorts, what we call a minimum viable product. But for me, it was a minimum viable infrastructure, the simplest, effective structure supporting consistent positive action regardless of circumstances. For my early recovery, this MVP included four components. First, a dedicated savings account specifically for emergency fund development, creating physical separation between these funds and everyday money that prevented casual access or commingling with regular spending resources. Second, an automated weekly transfer that was scheduled immediately after any anticipated income receipt, removing both decision requirement and implementation friction that might otherwise prevent consistent action during challenging periods. Third, a simple tracking system documenting both individual contributions and accumulated totals, creating visible evidence of progress that maintained motivation through inevitable challenging periods. And finally, basic accountability through regular review conversations with Casey, establishing external oversight and accountability that supported internal commitment through both encouragement and potential disappointment avoidance. This MVP infrastructure proved sufficient for early recovery when resources remained severely limited and financial complexity remained relatively low. As circumstances improved, this system evolved to support expanded capabilities while maintaining the essential consistency established through those initial small actions. For those building first growth systems from modest beginnings, here's a few simple principles from my own experience that can help you with improved outcomes. Begin with manual systems before implementing automation. Creating that direct engagement that establishes psychological ownership before convenience potentially reduces awareness. My first 2 months of transfers happened through deliberate weekly actions rather than automated systems. It built a habit and muscle before adding automation efficiency. Start with implementing the minimum effective structure rather than perfect comprehensive systems, recognizing that execution consistency matters much more than theoretical optimization during early recovery. My initial tracking used a simple wall chart that I talked about rather than some sophisticated software. It provided the essential visibility without implementation barriers or sophistication that might have been created. Creating that physical separation between different financial purposes through dedicated accounts prevents that mental accounting error that often undermine growth progress. My separate emergency savings account established clear distinction from everyday money, preventing the fungibility problems single account approaches frequently create. And then establish appropriate accountability matching your specific motivation patterns, whether through relationship oversight, public commitments, or tracking systems with particular personal importance. My weekly check ins with Casey provided external accountability that supported internal motivation during those challenging periods when dedication might have wavered without that oversight. After about 6 months of consistent manual tracking, I did implement a more sophisticated spreadsheet system that provided additional metrics while maintaining the essential contribution documentation established from the beginning. Around the same time, I added percentage based savings allocation alongside the fixed weekly transfers, allowing increasing income to automatically generate proportional savings growth beyond that baseline $25 weekly commitment. At the 1 year mark, with emergency fund completion approaching, I established separate systematic savings for additional financial goals while maintaining the original emergency fund approach that had demonstrated this consistent effectiveness. For those concerned that small beginnings might limit eventual financial impact, my experience demonstrates that initial modest systems create the foundation for substantially larger impact as your circumstances improve. The $25 weekly transfers established infrastructure and habits, eventually supporting much larger financial development. For those implementing similar approaches, recognizing this expansion potential creates important perspective beyond immediate modest impacts. The systems supporting your initial small actions contain the essential elements, eventually driving much more substantial financial progress as your circumstances improve. Building the effective systematic approaches through small actions establishes scalable foundations for significant growth rather than merely accumulating modest resources. While small actions create immediate psychological benefits and system foundations, their most dramatic impact emerges through compounding effects over extended periods of time. This long term dimension transforms seemingly insignificant behavior into remarkably powerful financial forces through consistent application across sufficient timeframes. My $25 weekly savings habit offers a perfect illustration of this compounding progression. What began as modest emergency savings eventually created substantial financial transformation through both direct accumulation and expanded application across increasing dimensions. The pure mathematical progression shows significant accumulation despite modest individual contributions. After 6 months, 650 in direct savings through consistent weekly transfers. After 1 year, 1300 in accumulated emergency funds. And after 2 years, 2600 in basic savings, plus modest interest accumulation. While these amounts alone wouldn't create transformative financial change, they established a crucial foundation for subsequent phases that dramatically accelerated impact. This progression demonstrates how consistent, modest actions eventually create meaningful mathematical results simply through persistent application over that sufficient amount of time. However, the more powerful compounding occurred through expanded implementation rather than just continued identical action. As the $25 habit demonstrated consistent success, I gradually applied the same approach at larger scales and across additional financial dimensions. At approximately the 1 year mark, with consistent $25 transfers firmly established, I implemented a percentage based savings alongside that fixed weekly amount. Initially, just 3% of my consulting income. This modest additional allocation created accelerating accumulation as earnings gradually improved during continued recovery. Around 18 months into rebuilding, the combined fixed and percentage based approach generated sufficient emergency reserves to begin modest retirement saving using identical systematic methods. The initial 5% retirement allocation seemed insignificant in isolation, but established crucial early participation in long term investment growth. By my 2 year mark, with multiple systematic savings approaches running concurrently, I implemented similar structured approaches to debt reduction, consumer decisions, and eventually investment allocations beyond retirement accounts. The habit strength developed through those initial $25 transfers created the capacity for maintaining multiple consistent financial behaviors simultaneously, rather than isolated improvement in a single dimension. This comprehensive application across various financial areas multiplied the impact far beyond what any individual behavioral thread might have accomplished alone. For those implementing similar small habit approaches, understanding several key compounding mechanisms creates realistic expectations while maintaining motivation through inevitable progress plateaus. Direct financial compounding through interest or investment returns eventually accelerates accumulation beyond mere contribution addition. While early recovery typically generates minimal compound returns due to limited amounts and conservative positioning, establishing systematic savings creates necessary foundations for eventual return driven growth as circumstances improve. Behavioral compounding through expanded habit application typically creates even more powerful effects than mathematical compounding alone during these rebuilding periods. The capacity to maintain multiple consistent financial behaviors simultaneously developed through initial small habit strength enables comprehensive financial improvement across various dimensions rather than just isolated progress in single areas. Then psychological compounding through growing self perception as financially capable gradually expands action capacity beyond initial modest behaviors. The identity shift from financial victim to capable money manager established through consistent small action evidence eventually supports increasingly significant financial decisions aligned with the strengthened self concept. And then finally, opportunity compound through growing financial capacity creates access to options unavailable during earlier limitation periods. The flexibility provided by accumulated emergency reserves, improved credit access, growing income capacity, and strengthened financial confidence eventually generates opportunities inaccessible during early recovery, regardless of behavioral intention. These various compounding mechanisms interact synergistically rather than merely adding together, creating accelerating impact as recovery progresses. The combined effect eventually transforms modest beginnings into substantial outcomes through persistent application across sufficient timeframes. The small habit foundations established during earlier recovery periods created capacity for managing substantial resources effectively when later career advancement generated significantly increased income potential. Without these foundational behaviors, larger financial opportunities might have created repeated, unsustainable expansion rather than progressive wealth accumulation. For those currently implementing similar small beginnings, maintaining perspective about this long term potential proves crucial during inevitable progress plateaus or seemingly insignificant short term results. The transformative power emerges through persistent application rather than immediate dramatic outcomes, requiring patience alongside consistency for maximum impact. The most important insight from my experience involves recognizing small habits as identity foundation rather than merely financial techniques. My consistent $25 transfers represented evidence of becoming someone who honors financial commitments regardless of circumstance, a fundamental identity shift that eventually supported much more significant financial behaviors aligned with this strengthened self concept. This identity explains why identical financial behaviors create dramatically different long term outcomes when implemented with different perspectives. Approaching these small habits as fundamentally transformative identity components rather than merely mathematical accumulation techniques creates the persistence necessary for their most significant impact to emerge through sufficient implementation timeframes. Now let's talk about maintaining consistency through challenging times. The transformative potential of small financial habits emerges only through consistent implementation despite inevitable challenges. Without effective maintenance approaches, even the most promising, modest beginnings frequently falter before creating their most significant impacts. My $25 weekly savings habit faced numerous potential derailment points throughout the implementation, from income fluctuations or unexpected expenses to competing priorities and even simple motivation challenges. Developing specific consistency protection strategies proved essential for maintaining unbroken implementation through these various obstacles. Income variability really created the most significant challenge for me during early rebuilding, as consulting revenue always fluctuated dramatically month to month. My solution involved creating what I'd call implementation buffers. These are protective mechanisms ensuring habit continuity despite irregular resource availability. I did this with a dedicated account maintaining about 8 weeks of transfer capacity, $200, creating continuity protection during income gaps or unexpected timing challenges. This buffer remained untouched except for executing that weekly transfer, receiving replenishments whenever consulting payments arrived rather than serving other financial purposes. Then a hierarchical financial priority system positioned the $25 transfers immediately after essential expenses but before any discretionary spending. This ensured available resources supported habit maintenance before less crucial expenditures. This structured allocation prevented also common not enough left outcomes that often undermine consistent implementation during these resource constrained periods. Simplified execution through automation also reduced friction during those challenging periods when decision fatigue might otherwise have disrupted my consistency. The established automatic transfers continued without requiring renewed commitment or implementation effort during particularly stressful intervals. So these buffers protected implementation integrity for me during especially the numerous and potential disruption points that I experienced, maintaining the unbroken weekly transfer sequence despite all of the income irregularity and difficulties that I had during these early recovery phases. Now, beyond income challenges, there was always competing financial priorities. This threatened the habit consistency as various urgent needs emerged during my rebuilding. My protection approach involved creating sort of a commitment boundary that were parameters establishing certain behaviors as effective non negotiable despite competing demands. These non negotiables included a $25 weekly savings commitment that received a designation as a core financial practice rather than a discretionary allocation. Establishing this alongside essential expenses for decision making purposes made it clear, as well as this categorization prevented treating this small habit as optional when resource constraints required spending adjustments. Explicit decision criteria established clear parameters for potential habit modification, requiring specific threshold conditions before considering implementation changes. The structured approach prevented emotional or reactive adjustments during temporary challenging periods that might permanently derail this entire emerging habit pattern. And then back to that same accountability system, creating external reinforcement for maintaining commitment boundaries when internal resolve might have wavered during particularly challenging intervals. My regular check ins with Casey provided both encouragement for consistency and potential disappointment avoidance as a motivation that supported maintaining this implementation despite temptation towards suspension. These commitment boundaries that I established really prevented me from the common just this once exception for a specific spending or a specific situation. And these just this once exceptions, they frequently undermine the habit formation by establishing, again, non negotiable parameters around core implementation elements. Now, occasional genuine emergencies created some consistency threats when unexpected significant expenses potentially required everything I had as resources. My protection strategy involved a maintenance minimum that reduced implementation levels, maintaining habit continuity during genuine crisis periods. A predetermined minimum threshold established the smallest acceptable implementation level during extreme circumstances. In my case, reducing from $25 to $5 weekly transfers if absolutely necessary rather than suspending the habit entirely. This approach maintained behavioral continuity even when standard implementation proved temporarily impossible. Then the clear restoration criteria determined when regular implementation would resume following any necessary minimum periods, preventing temporary adjustments from becoming permanent ones. This structured restoration approach ensured that minimum implementation served as temporary rather than permanent downward adjustment. For those implementing similar small habits during financial recovery, establishing appropriate consistency protection approaches creates crucial implementation insurance against inevitable challenges. Without these protective strategies, even the most promising modest beginnings frequently falter before generating their transformative potential through sufficient practice duration. The most important insight from my consistency protection experience involves recognizing that habit maintenance represents continual active practice rather than permanent achievement. Even after years of uninterrupted implementation, my $25 savings habit required ongoing protection strategies rather than becoming entirely self sustaining. By recognizing consistency as ongoing achievement requiring continued support rather than permanent status requiring only initial establishment, we develop sustainability approaches matching the extended timeframes necessary for these habits to generate their most transformative impact. Now, how do we scale these small, dependable habits into larger systems? While maintaining small habits consistently creates meaningful impact, their most powerful potential emerges through deliberate scaling into larger systems as your circumstances improve. This progression from modest beginnings to substantial approaches converts that initial foundation behavior into comprehensive financial transformation through appropriate expansion pathways. My $25 weekly savings habit underwent several distinct scaling transitions as my financial situation gradually improved through recovery. These deliberate expansion approaches maintain the essential consistency established through that initial modest implementation while increasing the impact proportional to growing capacity. The first scaling transition involved implementing that percentage based allocation alongside the fixed weekly amount, about 12 months into my recovery. At that time, my consulting incomes grew. Continuing only the fixed $25 transfers would have created decreasing relative savings as resources expanded. So by adding that 5% income allocation to the consistent $25 weekly transfers, I established a proportional growth while maintaining the foundational behavior that had demonstrated consistent effectiveness. This dual approach created several key benefits beyond either strategy alone. The fixed amount maintained minimum implementation regardless of income fluctuation, ensuring continued saving even during temporarily reduced consulting revenue. The percentage component, however, created automatic scaling that aligned with improving financial circumstances. This increased savings proportional to growing income without requiring repeated decision points. The combined approach established a balanced saving that reflected both consistent baseline commitment and proportional financial improvement through continued recovery. The maintained weekly transfers alongside the income based allocation reinforce the fundamental habit while expanding its impact through complementary scaling mechanisms. For those implementing similar scaling transitions, several principles from my experience again creates improved outcomes. First, add complementary approaches alongside established behaviors rather than replacing proven habits with new systems. Maintaining that foundational $25 transfer while adding percentage based saving preserves the demonstrated consistency while expanding the impact proportional to improving circumstances. Next, implement deliberate transition periods rather than sudden complete changes when scaling established habits. My gradual progression from fixed only to combined approaches and eventually to primarily percentage based allocation provided implementation continuity through successive improvement phases. Create appropriate documentation, capturing both original and expanded metrics to maintain perspective through your scaling transitions. My tracking systems documented both the unbroken weekly transfer streak and the growing percentage allocation, maintaining the psychological benefits of both the consistency alongside the expanding financial impact. So, the second major scaling transition occurred through expansion across additional financial dimensions beyond just emergency saving. As the initial habit demonstrated consistent effectiveness and emergency funding approach completion, I implemented similar systematic approaches in other areas. Retirement savings received implementation using the identical systematic structures approximately 18 months into my recovery. It was that same automatic transfer approach, consistency protection strategies, and visual tracking applied to growing retirement allocation, even to this day, that created expanded impact without requiring fundamentally different implementation approaches. Debt reduction systems using similar automatic payment structures above minimum requirements accelerated the obligation elimination through those same familiar implementation strategies. The systematic extra payment approach directly paralleled the established savings habit while directing resources towards that liability reduction rather than just asset accumulation. And then through maturity, investment approaches outside retirement accounts implemented comparable automatic contribution systems once financial stability permitted additional growth allocation. This happened closer to 36 months into my recovery. These expanded investment practices maintain the fundamental consistency principles established through initial savings while applying them towards longer term wealth building. These dimension expansions dramatically increased my overall financial impact while maintaining the fundamental consistency mechanisms established through initial modest habits. Rather than requiring an entirely new approach for different financial areas, I just used the same established structures across the expanded purposes aligned with improving circumstances. The most important insight from my scaling experience involves recognizing that modest habits, properly implemented, containing the essential DNA for significant financial transformation through appropriate expansion aligned with improving circumstances. The $25 weekly transfers established fundamental principles, eventually supporting comprehensive wealth management through consistent application and appropriate scaling as financial capacity expanded through my recovery and well beyond. Today's episode focused on the transformative potential of small, consistent financial actions, and our practical takeaway provides a starting point for implementing your own modest habit with significant long term impact. For those implementing small financial habits this week, I recommend focusing on two specific actions. First, identify and commit to a single specific small financial action that you can implement with absolute consistency, regardless of your circumstance. Whether it's $25 weekly savings, like my initial habit, or $10 debt reduction beyond minimum payments, or a 1% income allocation towards retirement. Selecting an appropriate, modest beginning creates crucial foundation for eventual significant impact. Second, establish at least basic tracking mechanisms that create visual evidence of your implementation consistency, whether it's through a simple wall chart, a dedicated spreadsheet, or a mobile app. Developing documentation approaches that highlight your unbroken implementation streak provides important psychological reinforcement, supporting your long term habit maintenance. Small financial actions create transformative impact, not through their immediate mathematical effect, but through consistent implementation over sufficient time frames. The power emerges through persistence rather than amount, making absolute consistency more important than an impressive initial implementation for creating substantial long-term results. Today, we've explored the transformative potential of small, consistent financial actions, from understanding their psychological benefits and system foundation roles to recognizing their significant long term impact through appropriate maintenance and scaling approaches. If there's one message I hope you take from this episode, it's that financial transformation happens primarily through consistent, modest actions maintained over sufficient timeframes rather than dramatic single decisions or impressive initial implementations. By establishing appropriate, modest habits aligned with your current circumstances, you create foundation for eventual significant impact through persistent application regardless of your starting situation. In our next episode, Financial Communication During Crisis, we'll explore another critical aspect of financial recovery, effectively discussing money challenges with those around you. I'll share my experience explaining financial changes to my children, establishing transparency with my partner, and navigating difficult conversations with creditors during my most challenging periods. We'll discuss common barriers to effective financial communication, approaches for honest discussions with your partner while maintaining relationship health, age-appropriate methods for explaining financial realities to children, strategies for productive conversations with creditors and financial institutions, and building appropriate financial support networks that provide both practical assistance and emotional encouragement. As you move through the coming week, I encourage you to implement the modest financial habit we've discussed today. Establishing this consistent practice creates foundation for eventual significant impact through persistent application over time. I'd love to hear about your experiences implementing small financial habits. If you're comfortable sharing, please visit realmoneypathway.com and let me know what modest practices have created meaningful impact in your situation. Your insights might help others implementing similar approaches while shaping future episodes addressing specific implementation questions. Thank you again for joining me as we continue building practical approaches to financial recovery. Transformative financial change happens primarily through small actions consistently implemented rather than dramatic gestures or impressive beginnings. Until next time, I'm David Kim. Remember, it's not just about money, it's about building your real money pathway to freedom. Thanks for joining me on the Real Money Pathway podcast. I'm David Kim, reminding you that financial success isn't about perfection, it's about progress. So subscribe now for more strategies, and remember, your journey to lasting wealth starts with the very next decision you make.